Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We've been on a pretty long journey here with the Bitcoin dominance metric. It is something we have discussed for quite a long period of time, not even just through the current uptrend, but this is something that I've discussed on my channel going back all the way to 2019 when I was actually bearish on Bitcoin dominance. But over the last couple of years, 2.5 years or so, I have been a fairly vocal Bitcoin dominance bull for reasons based around monetary policy. So my arguments have just been simply that as rates go higher for longer and as quantitative tightening continues, then the ultimate outcome is that the altcoin market bleeds to Bitcoin. It is not, nor has it ever been, a personal attack on any altcoin in particular. It is more so just an acknowledgement of this is what we saw happen last cycle. This is what we have seen happen in other business cycles with other asset classes, namely higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets. That doesn't mean the process is monotonic. It does not go up in a linear fashion. It is very much a stochastic process, and sort of the pendulum will swing from one side to the other, but the general direction for dominance for quite a long period of time has in fact been up. And since my last video on Bitcoin dominance, where at least the title is Bitcoin dominance, we have put in a new cycle high, right? And that's an important milestone to acknowledge because Bitcoin dominance has now hit 57%. Now, the reason why that's important is because a lot of people in the cryptoverse were very convinced that the dominance of Bitcoin had already topped going into the spot ETF. A lot of people were convinced that it had topped back over here in the summer of 2023. But what you'll notice is that it just continues to go higher and higher and higher. And the reason why I think a lot of people got this wrong was because they were sort of basing their Bitcoin dominance view on what happened last cycle, where dominance topped out in the pre-halving year, right? It topped out in September of 2019, which is why so many have come to the conclusion that that was the top there. And then when it wasn't the top, well, then that was the top, right? It was because that is what they would have expected to happen based on the last market cycle. But my argument has been that the timing of the Bitcoin dominance top is not just based on where you are in a typical 4-year cycle, right? It's more so based on monetary policy. And what is the Federal Reserve doing? The dominance of Bitcoin did not top in September of 2019 just because it happened to be Q3 of the pre-halving year, and people thinking that that has to be repeated every Q3 of the pre-halving year. It topped more than likely. There's no even definitive evidence that this is true in and of itself, right? It's just a theory. It topped after the Fed started to cut rates. That is when it topped. Not before the Fed started to cut. It's topped after the Federal Reserve started to cut rates. And so because of that, I have just simply suggested that it might take until rate cuts before we see the Bitcoin dominance top out, just based on what we saw last cycle, right? And admittedly, I might not be right about that, but also I think it would be fair to say, especially for, the people that have been the most critical of my views, that it wasn't necessarily wrong to think that, considering that at least at this point, Bitcoin dominance just keeps on putting in new highs. And now we have seen it go all the way up to 57%, right? You can see here this wick right there. It went all the way up to 57%. So really, the 60% target that I've been talking about for the last 2.5 years, while once it seemed almost unobtainable, at this point, it's not really that much further away. Now, again, there's no guarantee that we reach it, but of course, in this video, I will explain why I do think it will continue to go up. Not necessarily in a monotonic fashion, but the stochastic process should continue where it generally resolves to the upside. It was not necessarily just the Fed reducing interest rates in the last cycle that caused the Bitcoin dominance to top out. It might also have had to do somewhat with the fact that they started to expand their balance sheet in September of 2019. In fact, if you were to draw a line through the process from where they went from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, you'll notice that basically marked the top for Bitcoin dominance. So my view is just simply that as we continue into quantitative tightening and high interest rates, then Bitcoin dominance should continue to go up, just as we're seeing it do. Again, that doesn't mean that every week it has to go up. It doesn't mean that you won't get multi-week, sometimes even multi-month pullbacks in Bitcoin dominance. But the general resolution of it should continue to be to the upside the further we go. One question I often get asked is, why talk about Bitcoin dominance so much? And my answer is always the same. When you go to make an investment, you have to figure out, well, you should figure out, is it worth the risk? Is it worth the risk? And my argument has been that Bitcoin is the least risky asset in the cryptoverse. And the market cap of Bitcoin dominance, not the market cap, and the actual metric of Bitcoin dominance should go up, right? So not only is it the least risky asset, but it should outperform a majority of the different cryptocurrencies, right? That's not to say none of the cryptocurrencies will outperform Bitcoin. I have always admitted that there would be some that outperform Bitcoin, and there have been some that outperformed Bitcoin. But collectively, we have seen the altcoin market bleed back to Bitcoin over the last several years. And so if you go to make an investment in the cryptoverse and you want to figure out what your risk-adjusted returns are, you first look at Bitcoin, you look at an altcoin. If you can come up with a compelling reason why that altcoin should bleed to Bitcoin, then it would make more sense just to buy Bitcoin instead of that altcoin. If you come to the conclusion that the altcoin will outperform Bitcoin, then it helps justify some of that risk, right? But the reality is that most altcoins have now continued to put in new lows against Bitcoin, even this late in the market cycle. So that is something that, it wasn't necessarily going to be true based on what people thought about sort of cycle theory, but monetary policy certainly suggested that the dominance of Bitcoin would continue to go up. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about where we currently are, because first of all, I will, just acknowledge that we've put in a new high, right? So, the haters can say whatever they want to about it, but it wasn't wrong. It wasn't wrong to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. whatever they may want to say, right? This is a new high. In fact, if you look at monthly Fibonacci candles for dominance, it's just been in a macro uptrend since December of 2022, right? There hasn't even been a single month where these Fibonacci candles turned red. Not yet, anyways. So it was never wrong to be bullish on it. I think there were some people that it didn't really sit well with them because of it, the implication of what it meant for maybe some of the altcoins they held, sort of the devaluation of that altcoin. But as I said before, it's not personal. It's just a lesson I learned in the last market cycle, and I was hoping to relay to other people. As I've said, I'm not going to talk about this stuff next cycle, but I do hope that we can kind of, tie a bow on this theory relatively soon. And guys, I will say, one more disclaimer. Just because I've been right about it doesn't mean I will continue to be right about it, right? Sometimes I see people, they have a theory and they get it right, and then people think, all right, well, they were right about it, therefore what they say next has to come true. That's not even necessarily true, okay? So please also get other people's opinions and add those opinions to, to what you're looking at, not just mine, because again, a lot of times when something seems like it's coming true, even if it eventually continues to be true, it can swing back the other way for a while, because it is a market, right? It is a market, and there's going to be people that believe different things. So please be aware of that. With that said, Bitcoin dominance has put in a new high. In fact, it put in a new high this month, April, which is what I said, right? I said going into the halving, we should see dominance go to a new high. And we have, right? And we have. And that has not changed. And it played out basically as we sort of speculated it might. I know there's a lot of people thinking that it was going to top out at the spot ETF, and then the direction would sort of gear more towards the potential spot ETF for ETH. But what I said back then was that, well, the halving's going to come first. So dominance should continue to rally into the halving. And you can see that it put in a new high only last week. Now, with that said, it has now had a pretty substantial pullback to 55%. In fact, it's actually gone below 55%, right? I've watched it earlier. It wicked below 55% a few times. It's gone into the 54s. And it certainly could go back there, right? There's nothing necessarily saying that it can't. But I do want to explain, again, why I think it'll continue to go up and what I would be looking for to see it shift back the other way. So remember, first, I would expect us to have to go back to looser monetary policy. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to top out after rate cuts. It could be, right as rate cuts arrive. It could even be a month before rate cuts, right? But the point is, it should top out somewhere around that area. The problem that has been for the altcoin market is that these rate cuts, these theoretical rate cuts, just keep getting pushed further and further out, right? So, the rate cuts that were once being projected to occur in March were then pushed out to May, and then June, and then July. And now the market's not even expecting the first rate cut until September. Now, I do think there's a good chance we could get a rate cut before September, but that's one of the reasons why I think we've seen altcoins go to new lows on their Bitcoin pairs, and the reason why we've seen Bitcoin dominance continue to put in new highs. It's because these rate cuts that people keep waiting on, that a lot of the riskier assets really need to start doing well against lower risk assets, they just keep getting pushed further and further out. And so as the market continues to price that in, all Bitcoin pairs capitulate, right? That doesn't mean you're not going to get days like we've had this past weekend. And I actually warned about this many, many times in some of the videos that I did recently, and also in a lot of tweets that I put out on Twitter or X, a lot of posts on X, where I said, if these altcoins are going to get a bounce, right? If you're going to see ETH get a bounce, it would be just after the halving, if it's going to happen. there's no guarantee that it even happens. And you might say, well, Ben, this is a pretty big bounce. Guys, first of all, it's still right now below 0.049. Second of all, if you look at last cycle, you will notice that ETH Bitcoin had not one, not two, but three bounces off of the range low before ultimately capitulating. So far, we have only had two bounces, 1 and 2. So, is it possible that it gets one final bounce before rolling over? Maybe. If there is a narrative to accompany that, I have to imagine it would be people speculating on the potential approval of a spot ETF for ETH. I don't really think it's going to happen in May, but I could be wrong about that. I don't really have a strong reason for why it would be approved or not. I'm basically going on what market probabilities are telling me about its approval, and they're not so optimistic right now. So if there is going to be a third and final bounce, it would make sense for it to occur right after the halving. But whatever happens here, I would expect it to once again resolve to a lower high. What you'll notice about the third and final bounce here is that it was rejected on the weekly time frame by the bull market support band. It did get some wicks above it, but it still had weekly closes below. Right now, the bull market support band for ETH Bitcoin is around 0.053 to 0.054. So for me, if it's going to bounce, I think that's going to be your sort of your limited upside. And I'm not even convinced that it's going to. One of the reasons for that is because over here, when it bounced, it was not a weekly close below the range low, right? Here, we got a weekly close below the range low. And you can look at another example back over here in 2016, where once we got a close below the range low, we didn't get another bounce after that, right? I mean, we just basically bled until, for basically 2 more months. So there's these things that occur in the market, right, where you sometimes get counter-trend rallies. It doesn't mean that the overall trend has been incorrect. It just means that you're not convincing everyone on the first attempt, right? And every time that it tests it again, you convince a few more people. And that's why oftentimes what you'll see is on the 4th attempt, it will break. And you'll see that actually a lot, right? You'll see that actually a lot in markets where you have a trend line and it'll hold it as support 1 time. It'll hold it as support 2 times. It'll hold it as support 3 times. But on the 4th time, that's when it finally breaks, okay? I don't know. I want to be clear. I don't know if ETH is going to get a move here or not, right? Because, right now, it hasn't even really bounced. It's still below 0.049, right? I mean, come on. 0.049 is the level that all the ETH maxis told me it was never going to go below, and here we are. So bouncing right back up to 0.049 isn't really necessarily proof of anything. But I will say, if there is a bounce, what you'll notice over here is that whatever that bounce occurred, it occurred relatively quickly in the move, right? Within the first week or so is when that move topped out. Just after the spot ETF for Bitcoin, you saw ETH Bitcoin get a bounce, right? Right after it. But what happened? It just bled right back down, putting in lower highs. So we just are about to finish up the halving week. So if ETH Bitcoin is going to bounce, this will be the time for it to do it. But I'm not convinced that it has to, just because we already put a close below the range low. If it does bounce, I have to imagine a lot of people would assume that this would be the low. But my assumption, based on monetary policy, would be that it would be rejected here at its bull market support band, just like it was back over here in May of 2019, just before rate cuts arrived. What's funny is that this bounce here occurred at the end of April of 2019, and here we are at the end of April of 2024, which again is also theoretically a year where the Fed cuts interest rates. So is that what's going to happen? Is it going to bounce off, go back to the bull market support band, and then go down? Or is this where we are? where after you get some, here you had 2 closes below the range low, you get a week where ETH Bitcoin goes up a little, but then it just keeps on bleeding, right? But then it just keeps on bleeding. So again, how do I navigate it? My portfolio has just been Bitcoin heavy for like the last 2.5 years. For someone like me, I don't really care if these things get lower high bounces because I ultimately expect it to resolve to the downside. That is my view, right? So far, it's worked out. I mean, so far it has. Whatever people want to say, I mean, it has. I think it will continue to resolve to the downside. And this is what I would say about ETH Bitcoin. My base case is that it bottoms in June. Okay? That's my base case. That's flexible though, right? I'm not that set in stone on that. I think it could bottom in June if it doesn't bounce here. Okay? So if this just ends up being like a little back test of the support level that held for so long, and then we just keep on going down, then I think you get about 7 more weeks. And then once you're out in about mid-June or so, I could see it theoretically bottoming, and then that would mean the Fed would then cut potentially in July. Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out in August. Well, I guess it bottomed out after the Fed started to cut rates last cycle. So, I mean, this, in fact, in July is when it broke support. And that was just before the Fed started to cut rates. So I don't know if the Fed's going to cut rates. I mean, I don't think they're going to cut rates in May. But I will say, if it doesn't bounce, then I would expect ETH Bitcoin to bottom out in about 2 months. If it does bounce, then it might take 3 to 4 months to go to that 0.03 to 0.04 range. So that's kind of my view. So if no bounce, potentially a bottom in June, maybe July. If it does bounce, then it could be, July or August or something like that. So just something to think about as we continue to navigate the cryptoverse here and these moves that have occurred. And I do really vividly remember the bounce here off of the range low by ETH Bitcoin and everyone saying, that was the low. And then it just kept on, it ultimately resolved to the downside. So again, if it does bounce, I would expect it to be rejected by the bull market support band. If it doesn't, then you might just go into final capitulation into the early summer. And I think it would be honestly fantastic for it to not bounce and to just get about a 2-month bleed to bottom out the same time it did in 2022. Because if you look at this, what you'll notice is that historically, after ETH Bitcoin breaks the range low, it takes about 8 weeks for it to bottom. When you see that it broke the range low right here, the first weekly close below the range low, it took 8 weeks to bottom. We saw this first weekly close below the range low last week, and we of course only have gone 1 week since then. 8 weeks would actually put you in June. The reason why that's interesting is because there's some type of seasonality that comes with ETH in the summer that for whatever reason, Ethereum is allergic to the summer months, right? It doesn't like it. It does not like summertime. I think one of the reasons for that is because during the summertime, people go outside and touch grass. Maybe you should try it sometime. And I think that in the summertime, people focus less on risky assets and they focus more on other things. Therefore, higher risk assets like ETH will bleed to lower risk assets like Bitcoin, just because there's not really, you really need a reason for Bitcoin dominance. You don't really need a reason for Bitcoin dominance to go up. I mean, that's just kind of what it does. You need a reason for it to go down. And in my opinion, the way that it can continue to go down the way that Bitcoin dominance can continue to go up and ETH Bitcoin could continue to go down is just simply people tuning out this summer and not watching crypto. And when people don't watch it, that's kind of when alt Bitcoin pairs can bottom, when people just don't really care anymore about crypto. So I think it would actually be great if there's no bounce and it just bleeds until June and it bottoms out around the same time as it did in 2022. Because you can see in 2022, it bottomed out in June. right? It bottomed out in June. If you're kind of like what's been talking about with this weakness by ETH in the summer, don't take my word for it. Honestly, don't. This is crypto, after all. Don't trust, verify. Don't just let me blow smoke and you take it to the bank like it means something, right? Let's go take a look. Let's go look at the monthly average ROI. Okay, so we're going to look at the 90-day ROI averaged out over the course of of all of ETH's history. So if we do that, if we pull it up for ETH, what you're going to see is that if you buy, on average, if you buy ETH in January, February, or March, then on average, throughout all market cycles, all years, ETH is up about 2x 90 days later. But if you buy it in April, you can see it's only 1.5. Buying it in May, only 1.2. Buying it in June, basically break even. Now, clearly, there are some times where the market goes down. This is averaging out data going back pretty far to 2015. If you change this to 2018, you can see that it's not, it isn't, the numbers aren't as big, right? But it still gets into this lull here in the summer months, right? And if you take it out to 2020, you can see that, it goes down into April, still kind of low in May, but it doesn't really pick back up until the end of the year. And you can see that for a lot of different time frames, right? I mean, a lot of different time frames. It's the beginning of the year and the end of the year that have the best ROI for ETH. The beginning and the end with a lull kind of in between, right? And we're just looking at different calculation starts. High in the beginning, high in the end, sort of a lull in between. And so when you think about ETH, there is some type of weakness that often comes in the summer months by ETH Bitcoin. And we can actually see that if you go look at asset pairs, ETH Bitcoin. Look at the 90-day ROI of ETH Bitcoin on average going back through 2015. And you can see that, the best time, honestly, to get into it is September. Trading your Bitcoin to ETH in September has often been a pretty good time in terms of a 90-day ROI. And isn't it funny how last cycle ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September? Right? Imagine if it takes until September. I hope not. But in the grand scheme of things, it's only 5 months from now. This thing has been going on for 2.5 years. 5 months is really nothing at this point. I don't really think it's going to take until September, to be completely honest. But there are other reasons that have me thinking that it might take that long, and I'll show you a couple of those reasons as well. But I'm hoping that it just sort of bottoms out in June. If it gets a bounce here into May, then certainly August, September timeframe could be on the cards. It really just depends on when the Fed shifts over to looser monetary policy, right? I think there's a lot of people thinking that there has to be a certain answer to this question, but in reality, it's based on something that none of us know the answer to, right? So, it's going to be based on things that we just simply cannot know. And so while everyone wants to pretend like they have an edge and can predict exactly when it's going to bottom, and some people are predicting now, no one knows, because no one really knows exactly what the Fed's going to do. I think that they might pivot sooner than the market is thinking, especially if the market continues to be weak, because, some parts of the market, like the NASDAQ, are starting to show some weakness. But given that, there is often some type of seasonal weakness kind of going into May in election years. So far, this is really nothing different than normal. But if it were to continue, and if it were to evolve into something more, then it would be time to think that, okay, maybe they'll pivot sooner than what the market currently thinks. So the reason why I just spent so much time talking about ETH Bitcoin is because if Bitcoin dominance is going to go to 60%, I would have to imagine it's going to be on the back of ETH Bitcoin dropping some more, right? It's hard to imagine a scenario where ETH Bitcoin goes up and Bitcoin dominance continues to go a lot higher. Now, one thing that I feel compelled to present to you, which would potentially try to poke some holes in my theory, is if you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins and you compare it to prior halving years, you can see that in 2016, when the halving was, further out in the summer, there was a spike by Bitcoin dominance. And you can see in 2020, when the halving was in May, there was a spike in Bitcoin dominance, right? And you can see here, it was in April, there was a spike in Bitcoin dominance. Now, what's interesting is that every cycle, Bitcoin dominance, while in 2016 it had a really big dip going into that year, right? 2020, the dip wasn't as big, right? This time, the dip was basically nothing. I mean, it barely even went below the yearly open, right? So what you'll notice is that after the halvings, there has been historically a drop in Bitcoin dominance, especially out in the third quarter of the year, right? In the third quarter of the year. So what I'm thinking is that if ETH Bitcoin just capitulates over the next month or two, then you could still see something like that happen, where Bitcoin dominance tops out and then it kind of comes into a lull or something over here into Q3. But obviously, a lot of people are going to look at this and say, well, what happens if the halving is the top for dominance? Because you can see that there were some local highs by dominance in those halving years. But one thing to point out is that even though there were highs by dominance at the halvings, you'll notice that never marked the final high for that year. Like Bitcoin dominance in both prior halving years, did eventually go higher than where they were at the halving, right? So in 2020, you can see that it was here. By the end of the year, Bitcoin dominance went higher. In 2016, you can see that it was, right around here. By the end of the year, Bitcoin dominance went higher. So I would still be under the assumption that even if there is a pullback, by the end of the year, dominance, should be a lot higher. And also considering too that these pullbacks, while a lot of people expected a larger pullback by dominance going into the halving year because of what we've seen historically, look at this. There wasn't really much of a pullback at all. So maybe these pullbacks is not much of a pullback at all either if the Fed refuses to pivot. And that's why I think dominance has continued to stay a lot stronger than a lot of people thought that it would. So I would continue to look at this chart because I think it's going to be really interesting to follow. And if you look at other things like ETH Bitcoin in halving years, I imagine that might tell a fairly interesting story. So if you look at 2024, you can see that ETH Bitcoin has already fallen about 10%. In 2020, you can see that ETH Bitcoin by this point in the cycle was up 40%, right? So there's clearly a difference. Clearly, there's a difference here. In 2020, it was already putting in higher lows. Here, ETH Bitcoin is still putting in lower lows, which again, to me, suggests that the reason it's not playing out like that halving year is just simply because of where monetary policy currently is. That's the reason. Otherwise, it probably would play out like the prior one. But inflation is making the Fed keep rates higher for longer. It's nothing personal to ETH. I like Ethereum. I really do. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi. I've made my case for why dominance is going to go higher. And, I've certainly lost a lot of sleep over it over the years. But I'd like to tell my former self, from 2 years ago that, had all the people telling me I was wrong. I wish I could just tell them, in the halving, dominance is going to hit 57%. Ignore them, right? Ignore them. You were not wrong to be bullish on it. So then the question becomes now, will there be a final push to 60%? One reason why 60% is a target of mine, but it's honestly not the reason I initially came up with, But one reason is because last cycle, if you look at the Fibonacci retracement tool, dominance retraced to the 618. This cycle, you can see that the 618 corresponds to 60%, right? It corresponds to 60%. So that's the reason why I think ultimately that we will get to that level. You can see that once we cross the 0.5 in 2019, we ultimately hit 60, or we hit the 618 only about 2 months later, right? So if that were to repeat, it would mean we hit the 618 in June, which is exactly when I said maybe ETH Bitcoin bottoms out, right? If it doesn't get a bounce. Now, if you degens go full degen on me again and bid it up once again, then maybe you make me wait later in the year, right? Which, hey, you're going to do what you're going to do. I'm not going to try to worry about what people think if that happens, but that's just something to look at right here. And note that it did ultimately make it to the 618. Right? It actually, it did make it there. It took a long time to get there, but it made it there. You can see that it also swept the 618 again at the end of the halving year, right? On Bitcoin's parabolic rally. Now, there's an interesting trend here that you may not be aware of, but it is actually quite fascinating when you kind of hone in on it and look at it very, very closely. Because Bitcoin dominance has this thing that it does where it puts in lower highs for a while, making people think that it's just going to go down. And then when people least expect it, it just blasts through, right? That's what it does, and that's why there's so much hate for being bullish on Bitcoin dominance, because it often will do things like that, where it sort of lulls people into a false sense of security to make them think that their altcoin is durably outperforming Bitcoin, when in reality, Bitcoin is slowly sucking the liquidity out. And then when no one's paying attention anymore, when the social risk is basically zero, it takes off again. And you can see that it did it here, right? It also did it over here when we were in a parabolic rally during low interest rates and quantitative easing. But that's what it does, right? It breaks out when people least expect it, and then it just goes on these manic rallies. Now, what you will notice is not to look at the lower highs, but simply look at the highs and draw a trend line. What do you notice here? Put in a high, sweep the high, go back down to the bull market support band, hold it as support, and then blast on through, right? Now, look what happened the next time that happened. Put in a high, sweep the high, go back to the bull market support band, and whoops, alt season. Right? That's the alt season you guys want. That you guys keep telling me for the last 2.5 years I was missing out on. But I don't see it on the chart. I mean, again, my eyes are bad. My vision's not that great. I have contacts. But this is not alt season, And this is what I've learned in prior cycles, is that alt season only occurs for about 6 to 12 months. And then we all spend the next 3 years dreaming of it. And by the last person that capitulates their alts to Bitcoin, that's finally when alt season begins. Once everyone's convinced that Bitcoin is the way. Now, I do think Bitcoin is the way to be successful in the cryptoverse. But even though that's true, I respect the shifts in trends. And while Bitcoin dominance honestly spends about 3 years of the market cycle going up, with people in complete disbelief the entire way, it only spends about 1 year of the market cycle going down. And then we dream about that for the next 3 years. So rather than dream about that for 3 years, just enjoy the dominance rally, Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio, wait till looser monetary policy, and then altcoins start to durably outperform Bitcoin. But what do you notice? In both cases, Bitcoin dominance swept the high. In both cases. And in one case, we went back to the bull market support band, held it as support. And in the other case, we went back to it and we didn't hold it as support. When we didn't hold it as support, alt season happened. When we did hold it as support, the altcoin reckoning continued. Now, what's going on today? Well, you'll see here that we put in a high in December. We then swept that high, more or less, right here in March. Now, technically speaking, where we went in March was not a higher high. So I don't know if you can call it even sweeping the high or not. If you exclude stablecoins, it most certainly was not sweeping the high. But we're going to look at it both ways. If you assume that the March move here by dominance was the sweep of the high, similar to this one, then what you'll notice just after it is it came back down to the bull market support band, held it as support, and is now breaking out again. If that is the case, then that means we are here. And that means that dominance is going to turn around really quickly and start to go back up because it's had a pretty big pullback, right? It's dropped from 57% to 55%. So if we are there, then it means we're already on the third attempt. And this could be the move that is about to happen over the next 2 months that takes Bitcoin dominance to 60%. That is what I would hope, because I kind of want to be done with these discussions, if I'm being honest. I don't like being the bad guy. I don't. But that, I think, is where we could potentially be. Now, with that said, there is some evidence to suggest that the March move was not a sweep of the high. And that would be to look at the Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins. Now, if you look at it excluding stablecoins, what you'll notice is that we put in a high in October. And then we came back up to that high in December. But it was not a higher high. It was not truly a sweep of the high. This is truly a sweep of the high. Is it not? Right? No doubt about it. Excluding stablecoins, Bitcoin dominance put on a new high. I cannot tell you guys how many people have been telling me about dominance excluding stablecoins, about how it was going down. And I kept telling them, I'm like, no, it's probably going to do exactly what it did last cycle. So on the ITC website, we have the way to track it excluding stables. And look at this here. You can see the same thing happened, right? Lower highs. And then at one point, it finally swept the high. And then it had a 1 month pullback. And then it continued its journey. You see that? Lower highs, lower highs, lower highs. Sweep the high, just as everyone thinks that Bitcoin dominance is already topped. Think about how many people told you dominance had already topped in January, right? Sweep the high, and then it came back down for 1 month, and then it went on its way to put into the top. So if you look at that same pattern today, you can see something similar, right? Lower high, lower high, lower high, lower high. Sweep the high. We're now in that pullback, right? So this pullback right here is potentially the one that we are currently in. But this is a more volatile version of this, right? The range on this, just to give you an idea, right? It went from 57 all the way down to 50. So about a 7% difference. This one here has been about 58.6 down to 53.8, right? It's only about a 5% difference. So this one over here was more volatile than this one was. This pulled back to the third top, right? So you had this first top, second top, the third top, which was higher than the second top. It pulled back to that level. If you look at where we currently are, this is the first, second, third. The third top is right around where the dominance currently is, excluding stables, right? So what if we're just in this pullback right here? Now, if we are in that pullback, it still means that it could take a little bit longer for the dominance train to continue. But if that's the case, I still think it's only going to be a few weeks. One of the things that could cause, if people are going to speculate about a spot ETH ETF and it gives ETH some legs for a little while, I think it's only going to last a few weeks, honestly, because I think there's a good chance it just gets rejected in May. And maybe that's when ETH Bitcoin finally takes the plunge to 0.03 to 0.04. But you can clearly see this same trend occurred. Now, what do you also notice? The same trend here on dominance excluding stables also occurred up here, right? High and lower highs. And then eventually we swept the high, right? I mean, it's the same exact thing. But the difference, when we swept the high here, we just capitulated back down to the lows into alt season. So I think we are more over here than we are here. The reason I think that, as I stated earlier, is because when you look at dominance of Bitcoin, I think it's based and works around monetary policy. And we know that last cycle, dominance did not top until the Fed pivoted, until we went from high rates to lower rates and from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. That's when it topped last cycle. Precisely, in fact. Precisely. So because of that, because this has not changed, and I don't think it's about to change, I think it's going to be sometime later, maybe later this year, but it hasn't changed yet. Because of that, I think that the dominance of Bitcoin will hold support above its bull market support band. Now, the bull market support band right now is actually kind of low. It's all the way down at around a little above 53%. So, I mean, I don't think it has to go that low, honestly. As I showed excluding stables, it might just hold here. But if the degens just can't help themselves and ETH Bitcoin bounces one last time to the bull market support band, it is possible for dominance to fall back in to its 20-week SMA one final time before going on into the final move to 60%. My base case is that we don't need that. That's my base case, is that we don't need to see that happen. I don't think we need to go back down there. And the reason why I'll say that is because what a lot of times I'll see happen for people that are very convinced of a trend is that they'll miss out on the trend because they're constantly trying to trade counter-trend rallies, right? They'll constantly try to trade it. So, they'll be bullish on something or bearish on something, but because they're constantly second-guessing themselves, they'll try to catch every single move, right? So that means converting their Bitcoin to alts every single time you get these moves. And if you do that, you miss out on the larger move up. So for me, my base case is not to try to predict every counter trend rally. Because I don't do that, every time we do get a counter trend rally, I get a lot of hate that I have to deal with because the trolls come out and they're like, oh, how's Bitcoin dominance doing today? But I'm not in the business of trying to predict these counter trend rallies. I just want to know, is it going to continue going higher or not over a more medium time frame, like a couple of months time frame? And if I think it is, I don't really care about what it does in the short term. I don't, right? I really don't. So that, I think, is where we are, right? That, I think, is where we are. Looking at dominance, excluding stable coins, I think we're going to get one final push to the 618 at 60%. At 60%. Now, if you look at all Bitcoin pairs, you will notice that last cycle, they bottomed when the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. Precisely at that point. Now, we've seen a little bit of a bounce by alt Bitcoin pairs. I'm sure there are some comments on YouTube and on Twitter asking me about this because, again, they haven't broken down yet. And that's something that yes, they haven't. You're right. They haven't broken down yet. But that doesn't mean that they won't. In fact, last cycle, just before the breakdown, they did get one final push to near the bull market support band. They didn't even quite make it there, and then they capitulated. The bull market support band right now for all Bitcoin pairs is at 0.45 to 0.46, and we're already at 0.43. And we were earlier today, we were at 0.44. And remember last cycle, we didn't even make it there. So what if that's where all Bitcoin pairs are? The final bounce before the capitulation. All Bitcoin pairs over the long haul are oscillators at best on an individual scale. All Bitcoin pairs collectively bleed over the macro scale. That's how a pessimistic person would look at it. They bleed. And I'll show you why. Parallel channel, connect the dots. Those are lower highs. Don't take it up with me. That's just what the chart shows, right? I don't control it. If you have a problem with it, do something about your altcoin that's bleeding to Bitcoin, right? Over the macro scale, we have seen alt Bitcoin pairs put in lower highs and lower lows. Glass half empty approach, okay? Glass half full approach. Alt Bitcoin pairs are oscillators that top out at approximately parity with Bitcoin, where the alt Bitcoin pairs are equal, where the altcoin market cap is equal to the Bitcoin market cap at around 0.99 or 1, right? And they bottom out at 1/4 the market cap of Bitcoin, 0.25. And that this move to 1.35 and this move to 0.18 are just deviations that we shouldn't put a lot of weight in. So for me, if alt Bitcoin pairs come back to 0.25, that's good enough for me. I don't, if it's in a macro downtrend and it's lower highs and lower lows, then so be it, you know? Maybe they bleed a little bit longer. But guess what? I will have preserved the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio for 3 years by being Bitcoin heavy as opposed to being altcoin heavy. So this is the final move that I think needs to occur. The 42% drop by alt Bitcoin pairs to the range lows, which I think will happen going into the summer months. That is my base case. That doesn't mean you can't bounce around a little bit first, but that is my base case. 0.25. That's where I think we're going. Dominance, excluding stables. You see this wedge that we just broke? Well, we just broke through the range high here. But do you see this wedge that we're in? The top of the range is 64%. If you assume we're at 59% now, we're just below 59% excluding stables. That's a 5% move. 5%, right? From 59 to 64. A commensurate move by Bitcoin dominance, including stables, 5%, 55 to 60. 55% to 60%. A lot of these altcoins are already capitulating, right? ADA Bitcoin has finally taken out the lows, you know? Again, it's not personal, you know? And I said for a long time that I did not think this trend line would hold. I said it for a long time. Because you don't assume that an altcoin gains value on Bitcoin from one cycle to another on average. Some of them will for 2 market cycles, but there's not usually one that does it for 3. Not usually. There might be a few exceptions to the rule. You assume, base case, for like 99.9% of altcoins, that they are oscillators at best. At best. Which means that ADA Bitcoin still theoretically needs to go to the range lows. Right? And you can see that at the highs, it's lower highs. Again, it's not personal. It's just this is what it does. Now, do you remember earlier when I said that I don't think it's going to take until September for Bitcoin dominance to hit 60% or to top out, but it is possible? I want to show you one reason why. Again, it's not my base case. And there could be a case where Bitcoin dominance goes to 60% this summer, and then I flip my view on it, and then it just keeps on going up. You know, I mean, that's possible too. But look at ADA Bitcoin. Do you see this trend line here? Point A to point B. And you see where ADA Bitcoin finally bottomed? All the way down here. Now look at this cycle. Same thing. You see that trend line? Very similar trend line. Exhibit A, very similar levels too, slightly lower, but it makes sense that it's slightly lower because altcoins are oscillators at best. So you can see here that if you continue this trend line, if ADA Bitcoin bottoms on the final touch of this trend line down here, that doesn't happen until September, right? That doesn't happen until September. So if that's the case, then it could mean you still have a few more months of this chopping her out, right? If it took this long to get here, if it took a lot longer to get to this point, maybe it takes a little bit longer to get to this point. And so that is one reason it could take until September. But again, there does exist a scenario where it takes until September, but Bitcoin dominance hits 60% before September, because maybe the Bitcoin dominance tops out at 64% or 62%, or right, maybe it goes higher than what I think. Or maybe it just goes to 60% in September. One reason why I wouldn't put a lot of faith in a trend line like this is because there does exist a scenario where we just break the trend line to the downside. And if that happens, that could actually cause the capitulation that the market needs to finally find a bottom. One reason I wouldn't put a lot of faith in these is if you look at some other altcoins, you could try to draw a similar trend line, right? From here to here to here, and you can see that eventually it just broke to the downside, right? That's a further period back. That's all the way back in 2021. So if you just want to take it from here to here, you can see that if you were to connect this dot to that one, right? If you were to connect that one, sorry, I'm trying to connect these dots, but let me try to get it as accurate as possible, right? So if you connect these dots there, right, you can see that you do sometimes go below that trend line, right? We just went below it again. I don't know if dots are relic, but what I would look for is to see if it can bottom out against Bitcoin. It hasn't done that yet. It doesn't mean that it won't, but it hasn't done it yet. Is it possible that this is the low? Yeah, it's possible. But even if it is the low, you would still need to see it hold that low on at least one more attempt, right? So that's why, when looking at something like ADA Bitcoin, I don't think you should necessarily put a ton of trust into such a trend line, because there does exist a scenario where it goes below the trend line before September, just like Bitcoin went below the trend line. And it's been going below the trend line. And it keeps on trying to hold it. And, I think people keep on thinking it's capitulated, and then that's the bottom, right? And then it gets a pretty big bounce, and then it just bleeds on back down. And I think people are getting tired because they're like, well, why does it keep on bleeding back down? Alts didn't bleed this long last cycle. Or at least most of them didn't, that were not relics. Why is it bleeding? Well, one of two reasons. Option one. Reason one, it's a relic. Option two, we just haven't seen a shift in monetary policy, so altcoins haven't had the chance to bottom. So, again, for every altcoin, it's not personal. There's all these altcoins that could theoretically go back up and do great things in the future, right? They haven't had a chance to bottom out against Bitcoin, most of them, because we just haven't seen a shift in monetary policy. So if you have an altcoin and you're wondering what to do, what I would say is we haven't even reached the point where they've been given the chance to bottom because monetary policy hasn't shifted. Litecoin Bitcoin just put in a new low last week, last week. Link Bitcoin, I sort of drew this out a while ago. We'll see. I mean, you can see the low from June of 2023. See if it holds that low. Maybe in May. Matic Bitcoin is in outright capitulation. Now, I think Matic Bitcoin might bottom out 1 month before ETH Bitcoin. So if you see Matic form a low and then bounce off of that low the same time that ETH Bitcoin puts in a new low, that probably means that Matic Bitcoin has bottomed. I have said for a long time on ITC Premium that the spot to start looking for a low on Matic Bitcoin is at less than 1,000 sats. Well, guess what? We just went below 1,000 sats. We just went to 953. I don't know if that's the low. I could see it going a bit lower. We've seen a lot of times after Bitcoin pairs break, they drop 50%, right? And right now, it's dropped 45. If you look at ADA Bitcoin last cycle, when it dropped below the range low, it dropped about 50%, right? From here, this drop, a 52% drop. So if Matic were to drop 52% from the breakdown point, it would put it at around 800 sats. So that has kind of been my base case for Matic, 800 sats. It's already coming pretty close, right? Again, I'm not asking you to time the market perfectly. I'm just saying that it could continue to go down a little bit more if it's going to play out like some of the other altcoins did last cycle. Now, you probably heard me say that I think it'll bottom out before ETH. I think it very well could. Look at ADA Bitcoin last cycle. When did it bottom? It did not bottom in September when ETH did. It bottomed in August. But it also broke before ETH. Look at this. ADA Bitcoin broke support in June. ETH Bitcoin didn't break until July. ADA Bitcoin bottomed in August. ETH Bitcoin bottomed September. Now look at Matic. Matic Bitcoin dropped below the range low. Weekly close. I don't care about wicks. No one's getting out of bed for a wick. Weekly close in March. ETH Bitcoin below the weekly close in April. I think ETH Bitcoin might bottom out in June. Therefore, keep an eye on Matic Bitcoin to maybe bottom out in May. Now, again, if the degens are going to go full degen on me again, then maybe just shift that timeline out a month or two. But the process is still there. It's still there. AVAX Bitcoin. This is what I said, guys. This is exactly what I said, that this is what happens, and I drew the comparisons. I said, look, Dash Bitcoin, very, very similar pattern in last cycle. Did the same thing. It set a low in the bull market and then revisited that low here in December 2019 when social risk bottomed. When did social risk bottom? October. Over here, social risk bottomed, well, the higher low, right? December 2019. You can see clearly AVAX Bitcoin got a rally, been bleeding ever since the year began. Dash Bitcoin, look, same thing. I mean, look at AVAX Bitcoin. Pump up, slow bleed. Dash Bitcoin. See, you can see AVAX Bitcoin, straight, right? This low here was set in the bull market. Retest that low here. Bounce off of it, just like Dash Bitcoin did. Come back down to the bull market support band. Get a bounce off of it. Actually, it went below it, then bounce. AVAX Bitcoin, go below it, then bounce. Dash Bitcoin, bleed. AVAX Bitcoin, It's bleeding. Now, does that mean that AVAX has to follow the path of Dash? No, it doesn't actually. AVAX has the chance, the opportunity to try to put in another bottom here. There are altcoins that do that, right? I mean, ADA Bitcoin was a great example of that last cycle where it found some lows. That can happen. It's not set in stone. But because the Fed hasn't pivoted, what I keep saying is why take the risk of the altcoins when they're just bleeding back to Bitcoin? That doesn't mean they're not going to be successful. It doesn't mean that they can't ultimately give you great returns over a long period of time. But if you're in a period where an asset is bleeding for 3 years against a lower risk asset, it kind of just makes sense to hold the lower risk asset, right? I mean, look, guys, Bitcoin just put in a new low last week, and this is the thing that I dealt with back over here in October. Everyone's saying, well, I missed the low on Bitcoin because I didn't buy it in October. And now it's just at another low. I mean, the problem is I don't care about timing the bottom on this stuff, right? I just don't want to buy a falling knife. I'd rather buy it in an uptrend after the Fed's pivoted than to keep buying it as it bleeds. The people that will give me the hardest time about it are the people that bought it all the way down. I'm not saying it's going to bleed forever. I'm not saying it won't. I'm just saying it hasn't even had the chance to bottom because the Fed hasn't pivoted yet. Sol Bitcoin has been stronger than a lot of the other alts, right? If 20,000 sats breaks, the next support level is 12,000. Now, I've seen some people talk about Sol dominance because it's been doing pretty well here, right? But this also reminds me of a prior altcoin trend. No, it doesn't remind me of a prior altcoin, but it reminds me of a trend you'll sometimes see where the dominance of an altcoin puts in a high one cycle, and then it sweeps the high a cycle later, and then it just goes down. What am I talking about, right? There's not a lot of altcoins that do that. In fact, I imagine most altcoins don't do that, where they put in a high on dominance and they put in a higher high. So first of all, credit where credit is due. Congrats to Solana for achieving that. That's just a fact. I'm not going to try to take anything away from it. It's just a fact that it has put in a higher high, right? That's an achievement. Does that mean it will continue indefinitely? No. Could it push up again one more time? It's possible. But this isn't the first time I've seen something like this happen. XRP dominance. Look at what it did. First cycle. Put in a high. Later on, sweep the high. It's been going lower ever since. Right? So it's always easy to call for these major events in the altcoin market and to think they're going to go up against Bitcoin and get a lot of market share. These are all patterns we've seen before, right? In fact, I hear a lot of people talking about I've heard a lot of people say that Sol will flip ETH. But what's funny about that is guess when those narratives become the strongest? At range highs. This is the Sol ETH valuation. They become the strongest at range highs. So you have to be careful with this stuff, right? Again, Solana has done very well this year. If you have held it, you've done very well over the last year and a half. Just be careful because, I've seen these things happen before where you'll see dominance put on a new high for the altcoin. You'll see it go back up to the range high on its ETH pair, sometimes on its Bitcoin pair, and it still doesn't change the longer term trend. Altcoins are great for making money, but rotating back into Bitcoin is the way you keep it. That's the way you keep it. If you hold the altcoin for too long, you can watch its diminishing, you can watch it diminish against its Bitcoin valuation. ETH Bitcoin. ETH Bitcoin gives great returns in a QE bull market. It absolutely sucks in a QT bull market. Even though Ethereum does really well in QE bull markets, it's still been putting in lower highs since 2017. You know, that's a fact. Now, it's also been putting in higher lows, right? And I'll talk about that more if this plays out, like I've talked about. I mean, I don't mind talking about it now, right? These are higher lows. I'm not hiding behind it. I was bullish on ETH Bitcoin in 2019. My first video on my channel is right there saying it's severely undervalued, you know? So don't come at me with this BS of, well, why don't you talk about the higher lows? Why don't you guys acknowledge that it's been in a downtrend for 2.5 years? And really, it's been putting in lower highs since June of 2017. You know how everyone gives people a hard time to invest in gold because it hasn't put in, or now it has put in a new high, but it hadn't put in a new high for like 10 years? What about the ETH Bitcoin valuation? It's 3 years away from not putting in a new high in a decade. So, I mean, if we make it to 2027 and ETH still hasn't put in a new high against Bitcoin, then don't go give the gold bugs a hard time. You invested in an asset that went down against a lower risk asset. Again, I'm going to be bullish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, but I still think it needs to go to 0.03 to 0.04. And then we're going to figure out what's more important, the higher lows or the lower highs. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I could make a compelling case either way. Honestly, I could. You might think you know my view, but you can't know my view because I don't know my view on it. I don't know what's more important, the lower highs or all these higher lows, right? I don't know. How could I know? It looks like it's breaking down here to me, but that doesn't mean that it's not on some type of logarithmic regression journey, you know, where just like Bitcoin USD follows like a logarithmic regression journey, maybe ETH Bitcoin is following one too, where it just kind of falls back in to this range here, oscillates around it for a while, and then goes up. And then we finally figure out what's more important, the lower highs or the higher lows. I don't know. Others Bitcoin, the bane of my existence for all of 2024, because everyone's told me how it's only going to go up. Others Bitcoin in this wick took out all of its gains since the summer of 2023 in a single week, right? That's what the markets do. You take the stairs up, convince everyone they're right, and then you take the elevator down. Others Bitcoin just swept lows it had not seen since July of 2023, back when this whole thing began for the altcoin market. So I look at this, and I know that a lot of people have been bullish on Others Bitcoin since the year began, but guess what? Others Bitcoin basically topped out at the beginning of the year, and then it went down, it put in a lower high, and then it dropped. And now it's going back up. It's going back up. What's going on? Do you guys remember earlier when I said a lot of times it's like the fourth time that it breaks, right? You tag the trend line enough, the fourth time it breaks. You remember ETH Bitcoin? We talked about that. ETH Bitcoin here. This time it theoretically broke the third time. If you get a another bounce into the bull market support band and then break, it would be the fourth time. But if you look at last cycle, you can see that it was the fourth time, right? 1, 2, 3, and break. Sometimes those trend lines occur not horizontal trend lines, but diagonal trend lines. Now, diagonal trend lines are a bit hand wavy. They're kind of fluffy, if we're being honest. I'm not gonna, don't take it to the bank. They're not cashing it in type thing. But if you look at Others Bitcoin on the daily, what do you notice? There's a trend line you can draw. And if you look at this, you can connect the dots and say, huh, 1 tap, 2, 3, break. What if the move now is just a back test of the trend line to confirm that that is actually now resistance? I don't know. I mean, if it breaks through here, I would say the bull market support band will reject it. But I don't even know if it's going to break through here. But you can see that, right? You can see that 1, 2, 3, fourth attempt break. Remember last cycle, it was after ETH Bitcoin broke down that ETH USD had a larger pullback, right? It was after ETH Bitcoin broke down. Remember that, right? If you overlay ETH USD, onto the chart, you'll see it, right? ETH Bitcoin broke here, and then ETH USD had a correction. ETH Bitcoin technically already broke, and you can see that ETH USD is potentially in the middle of a correction. But you know those trend lines we were talking about, that fourth attempt, if you look at ETH USD, kind of see something similar, right? On a log scale. Anyways, the trend line, right? Sort of a fake out right there, if you want to call it that, right? But 1, 2, 3, if it comes back down, it might finally break. And if it finally breaks, then we go to the lower regression band, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of things, right? There's a lot of different things that, we can look at here, but you get the idea, right? We're seeing a lot of this play out. And remember last cycle after ETH Bitcoin broke, ETH USD fell back through the wedge, right? So you can kind of see it's falling back through, potentially back through the wedge here in the summer months, right? And now remember, when it fell through the wedge, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed like 1 month after it fell through the wedge. So if ETH USD falls through the wedge in May, then maybe ETH Bitcoin bottoms in June, right? The other thing to remember is that last cycle, Bitcoin dominance kept going up even after gold broke out, right? So if you look at Bitcoin dominance and you overlay gold, and you look at last cycle, right, you can see that gold broke out right here, and then dominance topped. So this was gold broke out in like early June, and then dominance topped, so that'd be July, August, so 3 months later. So gold here, it depends on if you want to say December, but really it was potentially February. If gold broke out in February, March, April, May, maybe dominance tops out in May, or maybe around May or June, right? So a lot of it seems like it could be lining up. It's just a really slow process, right? It's a really slow process, and when you sort of see these moves by others Bitcoin, where you spend the entire year where it's sort of grinding higher, but the top was the week of December 25th, right? I mean, that was the top. So like, yeah, a lot of people have been bullish on others Bitcoin, and they've been telling me, well, you keep talking about total 3, but you should be looking at others, which is everything outside of the top 10. Well, you tell me, right? I mean, as far as I can tell, the top was in back over here in December, late December, early January. And all you guys got excited that were bullish on this, got excited over a lower high, because now it's put in a lower low. Remember what happened last cycle with others. And I learned the lesson the hard way. And I keep telling you guys that this is the lesson I learned the hard way. And instead of people saying, oh, okay, they give me every reason why I'm wrong. But remember, last cycle, others Bitcoin, others divided by Bitcoin dropped 60%. It rallied 60%, and then it dropped 60%, and it bottomed out when the Fed pivoted. Now look at this. It's the same thing. Others Bitcoin dropped 60%. It then rallied 60%, almost 70%. And the Fed is not pivoted. And now from this high, it's already down 30%, right? It's already down 30%, which is, again, I called for this when it was at the highs. It's not like I'm just now saying it, right? I mean, every Bitcoin dominance video for the last 3 months has been saying this very thing, that others Bitcoin is probably going to drop 60%. It's already dropped 30. It's back up to only being down 15 or 17 or so. But if it were to go down 60%, that puts it all the way down here at 0.1. Connect the dots. Connect the dots, right? Exhibit A, B, and C. Just like over here, you connect the dots. 1, 2, 3 is where it bottomed when the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So I know some of these micro caps have been doing very well. But when these wicks happen like this and those alts get rinsed on their Bitcoin pairs, that's why it shows you it's important to take profits back to Bitcoin occasionally so that you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. Because then what ends up happening is everyone who rode this up and mocked me on Bitcoin dominance then potentially finds themselves down here in a few months, and then they're wondering why they didn't take any profits on random meme coin number 475, right? Then they wonder why they didn't do it. And it'll seem so obvious, right? It'll seem so obvious. Like, why did they think that was going to outperform Bitcoin as, you know, as higher rates continued and as quantitative tightening continued? Why did they think that? Because of the community, I guess. You know, because of the community. But the community, I mean, honestly, doesn't really mean a damn thing in tighter monetary policy. So, and the communities are really all the same, anyways. So yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin dominance, it is in a pullback right now, admittedly. There's no doubt about it. You know, you're from 57 down to 55 in a relatively short. We even went below 55 in a relatively short period of time. So I acknowledge that, and I'm not gonna, you know, that's why I try to address this head on, because I know people are be like, well, why is he talking about dominance? But you know, the crazy thing about it is no matter how many times it puts in a new high on any pullback, people are like, well, why is he not talking about it? But here we are. I mean, we went to 57%. We're back down to 55. I think we're just in sort of a pullback like this one before ultimately going back up. And that's sort of the more conservative view. The less conservative view is that we already had that, and we're already, you know, we're just up here, and, you know, this is going to quickly continue back to the upside, right? So definitely a couple of different ways that you could look at it, but those are my views, you know, and those are the reasons why I have been bullish on Bitcoin dominance for the last 2.5 years, since like May of 2021. And I know that we swept the lows on dominance going over here. And really, I mean, I sort of flirted with the idea of being bullish on dominance over there. I said, okay, it's going to be bullish going into Q4 of 2022. Bullish and going into Q4 of 2021. But then in Q4 of 2022, I sort of doubled down on that, even on the lower low. And then you can see what happened, right? Now, if you exclude stables, it did bottom in May of 2021, right? It did bottom in May of 2021. And also, by the way, the social risk topped out in May of 2021. So in order to see Bitcoin dominance go down durably, you need to see retail come back. Retail's not back. New highs didn't bring them. The halving hasn't brought them. What's going to bring them? Probably looser monetary policy and when they turn the money printer back on. But social risk just put in a lower low, kind of like it did over here in mid-2019, which is yet another reason why I think Bitcoin dominance is going to keep on going up. Because as people leave, that's when dominance goes up. So when could it top? I think it might top this summer, when everyone's out touching grass, not looking at the crypto market, because that's the best time for alt Bitcoin pairs to bottom out, when no one's looking at the market and no one is there to bid up the altcoins. There are some people there that are going to bid them up, but there's just not enough people, and there's just too many altcoins for them to all get that same bid, and so they just keep on bleeding back to the king. Then finally, altcoins capitulate. They go down to 0.25 on their Bitcoin pairs, right? Total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. They go down to 0.25. Everyone's a Bitcoin maxi, and then finally altcoins bottom out against Bitcoin. But I don't think we're there yet. I do admit that, we certainly have seen a pretty big pullback by Bitcoin dominance. It's possible that pullback continues for a couple more weeks. But I really do think that whatever happens over the next week or two, it's just going to continue to go up as we get into the summer. And then I think it might finally top out potentially this summer. It could take a little bit longer, but that's my base case, and because I think that Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside and minimizes your downside risk. For me, for Bitcoin USD, I just take profits as it goes up the wristbands. I have some exposure if we're still at kind of like somewhat heated, but not all the way up wristbands. But I think it's important to also, if you want to take profits as you get into some of those higher risk levels, I think that's okay. It doesn't mean you have to sell everything, but you could offload a little bit. That way, if there is a larger pullback, you at least took some off the table. And if there's not a larger pullback, then at least you still have some. And that's why I continue to think that Bitcoin is the better place to be. And my guess is that the way this will play out is that Bitcoin will do better than the altcoin market going into the summer, and whether it goes up or down. So if you want exposure to the upside, Bitcoin gives that to you. It minimizes your downside risk. I think that'll all change after the Fed pivots, but it hasn't pivoted yet. And again, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go down. I mean, it can, and I'm sort of just waiting for that moment when you do get a Bitcoin pullback, and then people are like, well, what about a Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio? Now that doesn't help, but that's all just going to be recency bias. The reality is that Bitcoin could drop, 50% from here and be in line with where it normally is in the market cycle. That's the reality that I think a lot of people would not accept if it were to happen, but that is the reality of the situation. If you look at ROI after cycle peak for Bitcoin and you take it out to the following peak, Bitcoin could drop 60% from here and be at where it was in prior cycles at this point in the cycle, right? A 50 to 60% drop. And if it happens, everyone will be like, well, they did call it Bitcoin halving, right? 50 to 60% drop, and it would be where it normally is. And if that happens, all Bitcoin pairs get rinsed, right? They get rinsed. There's one thing I want to finalize with saying. For a long time, I've said that I think that alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out before alt USD pairs do. Whether the alt USD pair is putting in a higher low or a lower low or a double bottom, whatever. But I've said that a lot of times alt USD pairs bleed for a few months after alt Bitcoin pairs find their bottom, and we see that alt Bitcoin pairs just put in a new low last week. But I do think there is a potential case where alt Bitcoin pairs bottom the same time as alt USD pairs. It's not, I wouldn't say it's my base case, but there is a chance that could happen. If it does happen, I think it would have to happen on a capitulation wick. So if you get a sort of a capitulation wick by Bitcoin where it drops a lot and alt Bitcoin pairs are just capitulating, and then you get a big bounce out of that upon money printer being turned back on, there's a chance they could bottom at the same time. Base case is that they still bottom, you still see alt USD pairs bleed for a little bit even after alt Bitcoin pairs bottom, but I could see an outcome where they bottom at the same time. And so I want to be diligent about exploring that idea based on whatever potential outcome there is. And the reason why I say that is because if there is, sort of a larger capitulation in the traditional markets, and it takes Bitcoin down with it, because actually Bitcoin's holding up better right now than traditional markets. If you look at sort of the weekly time frame and you look at something like the bull market support band, you can see Bitcoin's above its bull market support band, whereas the S&P is already at its bull market support band, and the NASDAQ is below it, and the Russell is below it, right? So crypto right now, Bitcoin's actually holding up better than traditional markets. That doesn't mean it's going to forever, but it is so far. This has been going on a long time, and I do wonder if I wonder if there exists a scenario that when the unemployment rate hits 4%, the market capitulates. because it's kind of in that number that everyone keeps waiting for and waiting for, and it just keeps not happening. If it hits it, I could see the market capitulating and then the Fed coming to the rescue almost immediately. And if that happens, there does exist a scenario where alts bottom against Bitcoin the same time as they do against the US dollar in that scenario, whether it's a higher low or a lower low, whatever, right? Be aware of that. It depends on if it's a capitulation or if it's a slow bleed, right? And what I mean by that is in 2019, it was a slow bleed. And then eventually we got a capitulation, again, induced by a pandemic. But there's other things that can induce capitulations, right? We also had a capitulation over here in late 2018, and we didn't have a pandemic back then, right? So it depends on the nature of how this resolves, right? If you get a period of lower highs and lower lows, like just kind of like that, then Bitcoin dominance likely goes up until Bitcoin breaks below the 20-week SMA. If, on the other hand, you just get a massive capitulation wick on a 4% unemployment rate, if inflation is still printing, between 3 to 4%, then it could occur at the same time. So I just want to make sure that I communicate that potential idea. It's going to depend on the nature of the move, right? Whether it's lower highs and lower lows or just simply a capitulation. By the way, there does theoretically exist a scenario, and I will continue to keep mentioning it, of a left translated cycle where all of these views about a lower high, lower low thing are invalid, and we just keep on following what we historically have done based on a prior peak rather than the final peak. So if you look at peak to peak from November, it looks like Bitcoin's ahead of schedule. From November 2021. If you take it from April 2021, it kind of looks like this is where it was in the last cycle, and then you can see what happened. So again, it's not my base case to assume that, but if that happens, then you likely get a much brutal bear market that lasts for a lot longer. So I hope that doesn't happen, honestly, because it would probably lead to a more brutal bear market, kind of like a .com style crash. If you can kind of just top out here and bleed into the summer, then the cycle might peak out when it normally does. If, on the other hand, you just get a left translated cycle, it'll be fun for a few months, right? I mean, it would be fun for a few months, but it would probably be over before you know it. I mean, maybe 3 more months and then it's over, and then you have a brutal bear market that is really difficult, So I kind of hope it doesn't do that because of the ramifications that would mean following it. But if it does, that would just be, just something to think about, right? Something at least to be aware of. And I don't know. I really don't know if that's going to play out or not. I do have it in the back of my head of like a what if, right? A what if thing. Like, what if it continues to follow that? Again, not my base case. And looking at things like the S&P struggling and looking at like the Russell struggling. I mean, if you were expecting a left translated peak that goes into the summer, then I would think that that would be on the back of traditional markets continuing to go up. But traditional markets are not going up right now. They've started to go down. So that would be something to look at. I mean, you can look at maybe this trend line here on the NASDAQ and see that, for it to hit that trend line, it would still have to go down even a little bit more. For the S&P, that same trend line, if you draw it out here, it would obviously be a lot further out. If you take it to this one and just kind of call that a fake out, it would still have a little bit lower to go to ultimately hit that trend line. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where we stand. And, I really don't know if the left translated peak is going to happen. One crazy idea is that there could be a scenario where the left translated peak is already in March. I mean, the .com crash actually started in March of the election year. So that is a possibility. Again, it's honestly not my base case. It's really not, but it is something to consider that when you have these, and one of the reasons why it probably wouldn't be my base case is because the Bitcoin risk hasn't gone up all the way to the 0.9 to 1 risk band. If Bitcoin does do something like that and it just continues to go up, then yeah, I mean, then you could have that example, but I'm not seeing it at the moment, right? I'm just not seeing it at the moment. Instead, you're just kind of seeing alt Bitcoin pairs go down, and you're also seeing alt USD pairs go down, right? I mean, a lot of these altcoins are really struggling here, right? I mean, like Matic is nowhere near, where you would expect to see some of these altcoins in a left translated cycle. I mean, in fact, it looks more like it's closer to final capitulation than it is a major top, you know. .USD is only 50% off the low, or 100% off the lows, right? It's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like thousands of percent off the lows, right? ADA, Litecoin, they're closer to their lows than they are to their highs. So that's why I would potentially argue that it's more likely that you're getting closer to the end of that than a potentially left translated peak. But that is something to sort of keep in mind. For at least a little bit longer. So again, not my base case, but there are certainly things to think about it. And there was one thing that I do look at from time to time as sort of like a left translated evidence or something, and that's the launch of the QQQ, which tracks the Nasdaq. It actually launched in here in 1999. It actually launched around $48. Which is funny because when Bitcoin spot ETF launched, it launched at 48K. And then you can see that the spot ETF, the QQQ went all the way up to 120. So if Bitcoin were to go to 120, then maybe there's more evidence of a left translated peak. However, when this went from 48 to 120, it took it a full year, right? I mean, it took it from March until until the following March, right? So that's a long time. And really, it didn't even get up into the 70s until November, which was more than half a year after it launched. Bitcoin has already gone into the 70s, and it did it almost immediately after the launch, right? So that's why there could be a left translated peak, but maybe it still doesn't occur until like the end of the year or early next year. Again, it's still, I mean, if it's early next year, then it's not really a left translated peak. It's just a normal peak. But that's just some evidence for the whole left translated thing. Again, I'm not a big proponent of the idea. I respect the people that are, is the point, right? I respect the people that are, and I value their opinion. And so because they talk about it, I find it important. And, I'll continue to track it. But I also think that if at the end of the day, price action is king, and technically Bitcoin put in its top in November of 2021, not April. So if you take it from there, you can kind of see that Bitcoin has a lot of wiggle room here. It could fall back in and still be on track with the prior cycles. So imagine that happens. If Bitcoin falls back in, as it falls back into the prior cycles, that's where Bitcoin dominance tops. And then Bitcoin continues its rally, but at that point, it continues the rally as Bitcoin dominance goes down. That's kind of what I could see happening. Just sort of tie it all in and put a bow on it. So we'll see what plays out. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the content. If you do, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'm losing my voice. I don't know how long the video is. It's probably too long. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.